Everything Old is New Again, America's entertainment pop culture talk show.
It may well possess a rudimentary intelligence.
I'm trying to think, but nothing happens.
Felt a great disturbance in the force.
Hello, I'm Mr. Red.
Come on, Mark, like a dog for me.
Where's the goodies? Leave the gun. Take the cannoli.
I bet you wouldn't have done anything like this if Mom and Dad were here.
You filthy criminal.
Excuse me while I whip this out.
Go ahead. Make my day.
Here are your hosts, Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
The CBS Radio Mystery Theater presents... Come in. Welcome. I'm E.G. Marshall.
Welcome to Everything Old is New Again. This is Douglas Viviani, sans our usual co-host, David Cohen, who unfortunately is unavailable this week, but rest assured, he'll be back to the show next week with no other missed shows on the schedule, but he's out today, and that's okay, because we have a special guest that will be sitting in his co-host chair today. We're very excited to welcome this gentleman who will, as you may have been able to tell from our intro there, be able to follow up on our prior discussions of Radio and Mystery Theater and Paul Hecht and Bob Caliban and more. Radio and Mystery Theater engineer and 40-year gentleman who had a career of 40 years in radio and television, and thereafter there was just a litany of things that this gentleman has done that we'll explore and be happy to hear from. All kinds of avenue, behind the scenes stories of what radio was like, where it was going at the time, where it is today, and more specifically maybe a little bit about Radio Mystery Theater and Hyman Brown, the creator of same. And so we can say, welcome, Henry Lenz, to Everything Old is New Again.
Hi, Doug. How are you? And hi to all your listeners. And looking forward to talking about my career.
Terrific. And I'll tell you, growing up, before you began working on radio, I wonder, did you have any interest in radio itself? And if so, who did you listen to that influenced you and why?
My earliest memories are having a tape recorder at home, pretending to be a disc jockey. And that's because I listened to the New York disc jockey on WABC radio, Dan Ingram. Every day after high school, I would either watch CD sales on the television or listen to Dan on the radio. And I guess I had an affinity or an attraction to listening to radio. It's something that I always remember being very interested in and excited about.
And it's like having a friend with you in some ways when you get to know, in your case, Dan Ingram, or somebody that you enjoyed listening to when you were younger and by yourself doing homework or after school or walking to the ballpark or walking to the field to play baseball or something. You've got a familiar voice and a familiar personality, and we sort of don't realize how, to me, that affects you, and you carry with it through the years some of the effect of these personalities that you admired in the past. And further, on top of that, you then developed a career in radio. At least the beginning portion of your long and storied career began with radio. So if you could tell us a smidge about how did you get on the path to engineering and even sound for radio? How did you get involved in the behind the scenes of radio?
In addition to listening to radio growing up in junior high school, my parents were a good influence. My mom was very interested in the radio as well, and I remember listening to radio dramas with her. One of them was The Eternal Flame, which was it was almost a recreation of what was called the Yiddish radio hour, because in the history of New York, especially at Brooklyn, there were a lot of productions from immigrants. And Yiddish, which is practically a lost language now, was a centerpiece of all of this radio history. And I'll get to a little later, that's kind of where High Brown came out of as well. In addition to further answer your question, I pretended to be a disc jockey when I was a kid with a tape recorder, and I picked a college in upstate New York, a liberal arts college called Hobart and William Smith, because they promised me I could be on the radio station my freshman year. And so I became a disc jockey, and then I eventually became the news director there. And that sort of got me my start, and it turned out I had a nice aptitude for it. I had some skills. My voice was not the best, but it was a lot of fun playing college radio. And when I graduated, I had an English literature degree. And when I graduated, I just wanted a career in broadcasting.
And you developed a terrific one. And one of the beginnings, I think maybe the second year that you were in the middle of, or beginning of your career, was an experience with Radio Mystery Theater. Now, we've had Paul Hecht and Bob Caliban on the show in the past, and they will be coming back with Russell Horton in the future, so we're looking forward to that. But you were involved with the behind-the-scenes editing and so forth. Tell us what you did for Radio Mystery Theater, and then I'll have a little quote here from Hyman Brown to see if that carries forward.
Okay, well, what happened was in 1973, I was working as a volunteer at WNYC, which was the New York City AM and FM public radio station, hoping to get it hired there at some point. I had to get a technical, what's called a first-class radio telephone license from the FCC. I had to pass a test. What I didn't know is that there was a pipeline from the engineering director at WNYC to CBS Radio. Two directors were friends. So I was volunteering, kind of doing everything, engineering and writing and production. I got my license, and I went to the director at WNYC, a gentleman named Henry Wei. I said, I got my license. Can you give me the next job opening? He said, I've been waiting for you to pass the test. You have an interview with CBS tomorrow. And his acquaintance or colleague, a gentleman named Bud Arno, interviewed me at CBS. And there's Walter Cronkite walking down the hallway, and and I'm 23, and I'm thinking, I'm never going to get a job here. And sure enough, a week later, they called me up and said, when can you start?
How about that?
So this is September 1973. I believe I was the first college graduate to become an engineer there.
And then then you began working with Hyman Brown. And
right. So how that evolved was in 1974, about a year and change after I began working just in general on various radio network programming, newscasts, things like that, Hy decided to recreate radio drama. Now, Hy had a big history, going back. He was born in 1910. He had a long history of all the broadcasts that he produced over the years, Dick Tracy, Grand Central Station, Inner Sanctum. These were all, back in the 30s and 40s, radio was like television. There were copious listings in the newspapers of radio shows. And Hyman was, produced all these shows, and now he wanted to recreate the genre for CBS Radio. And the president of CBS Radio was a fellow named Sam Cooke Diggs. And he took a chance, and he said, we're going to do this. And so what they did is they went to the Columbia Records building on Madison Avenue and 54th Street, New York. And the old Dr. Gartrey soundstage that he did his live radio shows in the 50s with an orchestra was available. So it's a cavernous studio with a big client's booth and 40-foot ceilings, and that's where the shows were done. There were a couple of people assigned from the CBS radio staff to work on it. One was a fellow named Marlon Swing, who was a director at CBS Radio. Another was Freddie Himes, and he was an engineer. And there was a problem with the sound effects, though, because Hy was not happy with the people that CBS sent over to do sound effects. So he got his own freelance sound effect technician. His name was Dick Maitland. As a result, there was a union concern because Dick was not in the engineering union. So they worked out a deal where CBS would send over a second sound effects engineer who basically would do nothing, but would satisfy the requirement to have a union tech there. And, of course, that was me.
And we're up against the clock here. We will take this story and dive into the behind the scenes of Radio Mystery Theater and more, and radio in general, with Henry Lenz right after this on Everything Old is New Again.
Lipton Tea and Lipton Soup present Inner Sanctum Mystery.
You're listening to Everything Old is New Again, America's entertainment pop culture talk show with Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
Oh, yes, it's called the CBS Radio Mystery Theater. It'll be on every night of the week. Not a continuous drama. It'll be a new original drama every night in the week.
And you'll be on each
I'm
of
the
these?
host, because some of these deal with the occult, some deal with ghost stories, some are mysteries, some are romances, but everything is with something with a mystery to it. Mm-hmm. So we're going to see what will happen. If there is an audience out there that likes to listen to just words and not watch the tube, as we've been doing now for 20 years.
Yes. And Everything Old is New Again has been doing for approximately 6 years, and we're going to continue to do so. And I know that everyone listening enjoys the theater of the mind, and we're exploring that behind the scenes with a gentleman that was an engineer for Radio Mystery Theater and much more, Henry Lenz. We're talking to him and speaking a little bit on the fringes here of a gentleman by the name of Hyman Brown, who created and produced Radio Mystery Theater and so much more. When I understand, he created and produced 30,000 pro radio programs in his career, and it certainly is in the Hall of Fame. Was in radio for 65 years. But one of the things that he did, as we all do, is he borrowed from one thing to the next. So when he created Radio Mystery Theater, listen to the beginning of his other show from back in the day, Inner Sanctum, and let's just listen to the beginning of that for a moment and see if something sounds familiar here.
Inner Sanctum Mystery. Good evening, friends of the Inner Sanctum. This is your host to welcome you in through the squeaking door to another half hour of horror.
There's a show from 1941 to 1952 that used the squeaking door as well, not the exact same one, but shows the interest that Hyman had in sound effects and making things come alive. And tell us, is that part of what you were involved in, at least in the beginning of your career, Mr. Lenz?
Yes. The first thing I want to say is that Hyman always said he hated the phrase the golden age of radio. He said the golden age of radio is now.
Right.
So he was very much in the present. And so I began, as I mentioned earlier, as a second sound effects technician. So if there was a cops and robbers scene and there were multiple bodies falling on the floor, I did the body falls, where I just fall on the ground next to a microphone. And, if for some reason the tape didn't work with the actors right, we had to redo it. So occasionally I got a little black and blue. We actually had a real creaking door in the studio, and we had live microphones set up on the floor, on a table next to the creaking door, and a lot of the effects we would do live along with the actors. Going back in, the history of sound effects, when it used to be live back in the 30s and 40s, the sound effects technician was a member of AFTRA, the Actors Union. And it's only when the technology changed and we started using tape effects that the technician became a member of the technical union as opposed to the Actors Union. But in fact, you're acting. It's not your voice, but you have to know when the actor's going to do a certain thing, pick up a glass, dial a telephone, walk through a door. It was quite a bunch of talents that I learned. Ultimately, a fellow named Jerry McCarty came over to do the sound effects. He had a long history with CBS. He actually worked on The Honeymooners with Jackie Gleason. Just being in that environment with people with a track record like that, and I was young, I was in my 20s, if I had known their backgrounds, I might have been more intimidated. Hyman, in his career, he directed Helen Hayes, Boris Karloff, Peter Lorre, Gregory Peck, Orson Welles, Frank Sinatra. And now, he's telling me, do this, do that, and I didn't know any better. I was just having fun. I was very, very lucky.
Right.
Mystery Theater ran longer than MASH on television.
The number of original episodes are 1,399, so 1,400 shows. That's a heck of a lot of broadcasting, a heck of a lot of original programming that were created by you and the group at Radio Mystery Theater. It was incredible. What was it like to work with him? In other words, you're in there for 1,400 shows. He had to have some habits, some things that rubbed off specifically on you, maybe that helped you with your career. What did you? I guess a better way to say is, what did you learn from the way that Hyman Brown worked behind the microphone? Or how do you say this, in the booth?
The way it would work is the actors would come in the morning and they'd sit at a table in the studio and they'd do a read-through. And I would have a stopwatch out, and he'd say, all right, cut that paragraph out. He'd get it down, because the acts were about 13 minutes long each, all 3 acts. And then about every 6 weeks, E.G. Marshall would come in, and he would read his script, which was the beginning and end of each act. And he'd do like 15 shows. So that was an all-day recording session. And then we had to edit E.G.'s narration around each act. And then finally put the commercials in and make sure the whole thing came out on time. So, I learned a lot from the process. Hy had a funny personality. Sometimes he was very cheery and chatty, and sometimes he was very intense. And especially when we were recording, he was interested in doing it in real time without a lot of retakes, because that's what he did, back in the 30s and the 40s.
Right.
And so we pretty much did an hour show in maybe an hour and 10 minutes. There were not a lot of retakes unless something went wrong.
And that's what I heard from Paul Hecht said the same, and what he had said was there was very little or if any that he knew of, and it may have been in the booth, timing. Like he knew instinctively that let's just say the segment was 10 minutes. He knew when that 10 minutes was on the way up, and he would give the sign to the actors to move it along a little bit, or whatever it might be, that they were 30 seconds away from the end of the scene, and there's a minute scene left, so they got to speed it up. I mean, were you there while the recording was happening, or were you there afterwards to edit?
So both. The booth engineer was a fellow named Fred Hines, and he was an excellent engineer. And then one day he just up and quit CBS to go work on some other project. And like I said, I'm there as the second sound effects guy for about a year. And Hy looks at me and says, "You're going to mix the board today, because I don't have anyone else." So I walk in there, and it's like Lou Gehrig and Wally Pipp. Right. The next thing I know, I mixed the show, and Hy said, "You did a good job. Come back tomorrow."
Now, mixing for us that you maybe not be so familiar, see on whether it be the recording studios or any pictures you see of this machine with all these dials and all these round dials and these levers and so forth. That's what we're talking about as a mixing board, and you would sound and try to make it sound as good as possible. The level, how high or low a person is talking, if they're too bass or if they're too much treble, you're trying to make it sound as natural as possible. Just want to let everybody understand a little bit. Is that a good description of at least the beginning of the description of a general idea of what he was asking you to do that day and from then on?
Right. And if you take a typical mixing board, you have a number of audio sources. You have microphones, you have tapes, you might have special effects, and you would have to combine them all in a way that worked. So the sound of the car engine didn't drown out the sound of the actor. So you had to balance the various sound sources in a way that made sense.
Right, and now these days we can balance those a little bit now. We press a button on the computer and it balances out for us. So if my voice is a little lot louder than yours right now, coming over the recording that we're recording the show or broadcasting, doesn't matter. I can press a button and generally speaking, it'll kind of do that. But back in the day, you had to do that from your eye and from what you were hearing and seeing, and make sure that all the levels were the same while they were being recorded, I presume, correct?
Yes. So there was a certain talent to making that work in a way that the director liked, and that you didn't have to redo something. And it was repetition, and I learned how to do it well. And you would be mixing a main microphone, which was, you've seen in pictures, it's sitting in the middle of the studio there, and all the actors just standing around it. So we also had what was called an isolation booth, where we would filter a microphone, so if somebody was making a phone call, they would go in the booth, and they'd have a different frequency of their microphone, so you could hear it. You could easily tell listening to it. One person's talking on the phone, and the other person in the booth is on the other end, and it's a thinner frequency, so it sounds like they're on the phone. We also mixed various music sources, music beds, bumpers, stings into the next act. So that came from the CBS Music Library, which actually happened to have a lot of the same music that the Twilight Zone had on TV. And then, of course, there was the sound effects microphones. So Jerry McCarty would have a microphone on a table, like he'd have a telephone prop, he'd pick it up and he'd dial it. Or he'd have a tray with gravel in it and coconut halves, and he'd do horse hooves, if it was like an Annie Oakley kind of show. He also did all of the walking effects. So he had a microphone on the floor with trays of gravel or slate or dirt, things like that. We did a show once in the Les Mis where we actually had him walking in the sewers in Paris, and we kind of made a sound for that. And then Jerry also had the creaking door, which he did live. And he also had a little mixing console with taped effects, like wind, birds, crickets, whatever outdoor effects, rain, whatever you needed if a scene was outdoors. And if an actor was leaving the outdoor, walking from the porch into the house, Jerry had to, live with his feet, walk the actor through the door, but he also had to adjust the sound effects he was feeding me off his tapes. So when you're outside, you hear the rain and the birds, and as he's walking the actor, closing the door and with footsteps, he fades out the sound effects, and now you're inside.
Multitasking like crazy. Yeah. I'm sorry, we're going to be back
right
after
this.
It was
a talent. Anyway, that was I talked about that a lot, which was the perspective of the listener.
Right. And
whether you were outdoors with the actor or indoors, it was a very important trick.
We appreciate your time here on Everything Old is New Again. We'll be back right after this. Continue talking radio behind the scenes, radio mystery theater, and radio in general with Henry Lenz. We'll be right back. Everything Old is New Again.
Now, back to America's entertainment pop culture talk show. Everything Old is New Again with Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
My gosh, are people still listening to the radio? You betcha. Yes,
Absolutely.
They are.
Absolutely.
And
one form
that's
or another.
why what you're doing right now, Everything Old is New Again. Yes, it is. It's new. It's something that people have not done for a while and say, oh my gosh, I could listen to that. They're creative people. And that's what's wonderful.
Yeah, there we go. Well, welcome back on Everything Old is New Again. Here we were talking back in the day there with Bob Caliban, a gentleman that lent his talents to about 175, if not more, Radio Mystery Theater episodes. We're going to try to reach out and have him back with Paul Hecht, and certainly we've lined up Paul Hecht, and Russell Horton to come back. So we've had some good response here on Everything Old is New Again when we talk about radio, behind the scenes of radio, and one specific show, Radio Mystery Theater. In this particular show we're focusing on a little bit here, and we have a gentleman that worked on almost every single episode of Radio Mystery Theater, Henry Lenz, in one form or another, mostly editing, sound effects, and so forth. So he's taking us behind the scenes, and it's quite a journey. We're enjoying this. And by the way, if you're looking to hear the old show that we had with Bob Caliban and Paul Hecht, you can go to shows 211 and 212 on our YouTube channel. Of course, that's where we archive our old shows that have already been broadcast on the radio. So feel free to go there, and you can find that on the YouTube channel and or from our website, everythingoldisnewagain.biz, everythingoldisnewagain.biz. Let's focus a little bit, Henry, about the actors. Did you have some or any interaction with the actors, or at the very least, you certainly watched them perform their craft, I presume, correct?
Well, one of the things that's wonderful about radio as opposed to television is it's very intimate. You don't have a crew of 30, cameramen and lighting and all these other jobs. Radio, it's the producer, the director, the actor, the engineer. So you really got to interact, meet, talk off the air, and enjoy the company of everybody you work with. Everybody was extremely professional. Most of them were doing Broadway acting in New York, and they would come in and do, 1 or 2 shows a week for Mystery Theater. And we'd go through a rehearsal, and then we record it, and if we had to retake a scene, I noticed that they did it the same exact way each time. So they gave a lot of thought to their craft. To act with just your voice is a pretty amazing thing.
If I understand that they, from speaking to some of these actors, they came in, they had one rehearsal, and then they performed.
We did an hour's read-through, and then we did a little over an hour of recording, and the show was done. I always said, he could do 1,000 Mystery Theaters for what it costs to do one episode of Miami Vice.
Right, exactly, and it's amazing. Let's hear from Hyman Brown himself, a clip from a show from the 70s, CBS Sunday Morning Show, where they did focus on Hyman, and they also focused on Radio Mystery Theater. Let's hear what he had to say specifically about radio acting.
The actor must understand that he's looking at words, but he can't read the words. He must take these words and make them come alive. And the radio actor is just the most skillful of all the professions that relate to entertainment, who can take printed words and make them perform. They don't sound as if they're being read. That's the skill of the radio actor.
And again, as we're saying, they did that with very little rehearsal. So you saw that, I guess, in play. I'm just going to throw a bunch of names at you. Maybe one or two will jog your memory of someone that you worked with, that you'd have a story or something you want to share with. I'm not necessarily looking for dirt, but something fun that may have happened with one or another. So I'm just going to throw some names out first and see what happens. Mason Adams, Kevin McCarthy, Arnold Moss, Howard De Silva, Kim Hunter, Fred Gwynn, Tony Roberts, McCady's McCambridge, John Lithgow. So there's some names that I think we all recognize. Anybody come to light there of your experience with any of them?
Oh, Marion Seldes was the best.
Yes.
The nicest person, a famous Broadway actress. I bumped into her years after the show was over, getting out of a cab in Manhattan, and she remembered my name. She couldn't have been more sweet. It was really nice to get to know all of these people. Earl Hammond was excellent. He was quite funny. Once in a while, the cast would just crack up over something, and we'd have to do 4 takes before everybody stopped laughing. And I just remember one show where he had to play 3 characters, so they would change their voice for each character. And that was pretty common. And once in a while, Hy would do a little cameo. If he had like an extra person in the script, he'd go out and he'd read that part. But we did all kinds of shows. One of my favorite was, I think it was called The Garden, with Russell Horton and Evie Juster, and they find themselves in this beautiful garden, and they don't know how they got there, and it turns out they're dead. The story is how they discover that. They're in heaven. There was another show we did about the lost city of Atlantis, and we actually brought in a piece of equipment called an oscillator, which we connected to the microphone, so the actors sounded like they were underwater, like they were gargling. We had a lot of fun times creating effects. Whenever there was a little mistake, if there was a crime show and the ransom in Act 1 was $1 million, and for some reason it was in Act 3 it turned out to be $10 million, we were not going to go back and redo Act 1. And I would always tell the listener to write a letter if they're not happy, if they point out a mistake in the script. So that you write a letter was a pretty funny line.
Well, this also must have been very interesting, too, because it wasn't like you were doing, let's just pretend for a moment that you were doing a show that was just a Western, like Gunsmoke, every week, over and over. You'd have the same sound effects, the horse, the getting off the horse, the door, and whatever. In Radio Mystery Theater, right, it took you from outer space to underwater and everywhere in between, and heaven and hell, and so there was, every show had a variety, I think, of what you needed to really kind of use to wet your whistle to really think, and you had to go through and explore things more than if this was just, like you say, a standard show of whatever it might be, a long range every week.
The ghost shows and the crime shows and every day. That's one of the things that was so much fun about it, is every day was different. And I imagine most listeners got in bed and they closed their eyes and they listened on their transistor radio. I've seen lots of comments on the Facebook group page. That's exactly what people did.
Yep.
And I always said, it's about the little boy or the little girl that climbs up into mommy or daddy's lap and says, tell me a story.
Right.
Not show me a story, tell me a story.
Exactly. And you know what? I think I might even have that clip. Let's see what he has to say to us right now, again, from the CBS morning show in the 70s. Jaime and Brown talking about radio drama.
You've been associated for a very long time with radio drama. Don't you think its day is over? Don't you want pictures?
Hardly. The pictures are right in your head, Woody. I make better pictures with your mind and your imagination than any camera can make with the actuality. What's important is that the words themselves take on a meaning which is not encumbered by faces or by backgrounds. The words paint the picture, and those words you hear. You listen to those words and create your own picture.
And you hear some background there. They were actually talking while listening and having a performance happen right then and there on the CBS morning show in the 70s when they did that. So that's why it's a little not as clear. But there's Hyman himself, right, talking about radio drama, and we're going to get into that a little bit in the next aspect. Next show, part of our show is about radio and what can it be, and can it come back to, or at least have a little bit of a peek into this these days of telling the story to the child, which I think, to me, maybe you, Mr. Lenz, you tell me differently. Have you shared any of the old shows with another generation, maybe your kids, or maybe if you have grandkids, I don't know, and if so, what kind of reaction have you gotten?
With my own family, of course, I would invite them into the client's booth to view the shows when we were recording them, because it was just so much fun to have people visit.
Right.
But especially on this Facebook page, which I initially was hesitant to join because I was worried about getting overrun with comments. Right. It's really been a lot of fun sharing with people I've never met the stories, answering their questions, just going over, the history of it and how lucky I was to be involved with it. Hy did a lot of charity work after the show was over, and I worked with him on that for the Metropolitan Museum of Art, for the Visiting Nurse Service in New York, for the United Jewish Federation, and Faston Institute of Technology. And we did a number of shows, in the 90s. I became reasonably friendly with Hyman. I even spoke at his funeral in 2010.
How about that?
Just talking about what it was like working with him. He died a month short of his 100th birthday.
He was very gregarious till to the end. I would say maybe 2006, 7, 8, in that range. I was looking through the computer here and there, stumbled across, I don't know how, his granddaughter, and had a development of a slight communication there, and she invited me to feel free to send a note to Hyman Brown, which I did, and he wrote back, and I have the signature on my wall to this day. So he did touch so many people, and it really was something that was memorable to me, and I'd love to see the reaction to someone that listens to them now, the old Radio Mystery Theaters. We'll be back right here on Everything Old is New Again. We're going to continue talking all things radio, Radio Mystery Theater, and more with Henry Lenz right after this, and Everything Old is New Again.
This is Everything Old is New Again, America's entertainment pop culture talk show with Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
Please, Mr. Jefferson. Now, look, you have to stand up to your father. You have to let him know you're a man.
I will. From now on, I will.
No. You have to stand up to him now. Tell the truth.
But I'll die.
Possibly, but if you don't tell the truth, you'll surely die. What life can be left you, huh? You'll spend the rest of your days even deeper within your father's shadow.
Mr. Jefferson, what do you want me to do?
Take a stand. Tell the truth.
Welcome back to Everything Old is New Again. Again, this is Douglas Viviani having a great time with a gentleman that was engineering and provided sound effects for many, if not all, of the Radio Mystery Theater shows. That was Thomas Jefferson Affair. Paul Hecht and Bob Caliban were on that show, and they were on, of course, Everything Old is New Again a little ways back, and we just had a great time with them exploring all of this for 2 long shows, which was a lot of fun. And Henry, do you remember Paul Hecht or Bob Caliban in any way, shape, or form?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I remember almost all the actors.
See that? And
I was young, like I say in the beginning, so I didn't totally appreciate who I was working with.
Right.
It was pretty remarkable looking back at it. One person it's very important for me to mention is the assistant director, whose name was Marlon Swing. He was not a minor figure in this. Marlon was responsible for everything: the timing, the editing, the music, putting together the show, putting EGB around each act, putting commercials and timing it. Marlon had a long, storied career at CBS. He taught music. He had a master's from Columbia University in music theory. After his retirement in the 90s, Walter Cronkite personally called him and asked him to work on a radio series called Walter Cronkite's 20th Century, and Marlon produced that.
How about that?
He was quite a remarkable person. And so after we taped every Tuesday and Thursday, a show in the morning and a show in the afternoon, and on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, we would do all the editing because it was a little time-consuming. Marlon and I would stand there with the script, take out the extraneous takes, cut it to time, fix anything that needed adjusting. And we recorded the show on two 10-inch reels of tape, reel-to-reel tape, quarter-inch wide, on old Ampex 350 recording machines, and it was all mono. To high, it was about the stories, not the technical gimmicks. So we would put the show together, and then I have two little cute stories about it once it aired. So these reels were sent over, and we edited it with razor blades. This was pre-digital. So you're actually pulling out bad takes of quarter-inch tape and dropping them on the floor, and then splicing it back together. At any rate, the shows then went over to the CBS Broadcast Center on the west side of Manhattan, where they aired from the radio network central control off a tape machine, and for like 5 hours every night for every time zone, during the newscast hourly at the top of the hour, we would rewind the tape, and then at 6 minutes after the hour, we'd start it again, and it'd go for the rest of the hour. The bird sound effects we had a problem with them, because CBS Radio, for all their stations, had what they called a net alert system, which was a frequency, and it would send different numbers to a monitor in the affiliates across the country. A 1 was the start of the newscast. A 2 was a commercial. A number 15 was a national emergency. So what did the birds trigger? The national emergency. So all the stations are like, there's a bulletin, are we going to war? What's happening? Is the president going to speak? Well, in fact, we had to put a filter on the bird effects to take out that specific frequency.
Interesting.
And the one other production story, which is kind of cute, is in all these 9 years of doing shows, we only made a mistake once on the air. It was Edgar Allan Poe Week, and as we were editing the commercials in, we had many different reels of tape there, and we put together the Telltale Heart, Act 1, the Telltale Heart, Act 2, and then Pit and the Pendulum, Act 3.
What kind of reaction did you get to that?
Well, we got a lot of phone calls, and after the first airing early in the evening, and we had to immediately go around fixing that. So it only was bad for 1 hour play. The rest of the night we fixed it.
Right.
But that was the only mistake we made in all those years.
Which I guess was the East Coast, correct? The first run?
Yes, that
right.
was the East Coast.
Interesting.
Yep.
Let's talk about High Brown for a moment. I just want to focus on him for a moment in that what his goal was, what he was trying to do, and he'll tell us himself right here again, another quote from CBS Morning Show in the 1970s.
The theater of the mind is eternal. The little man who used to come into the marketplace and sit there and tell the story, that's still the same thing. It's the little boy climbing up on Daddy's lap and saying, Daddy, tell me a story. Essentially, I'm still doing that, Woody. But I have to give it the contemporary electronic gimmickry, shall I call it, that makes it immediate now. And we're doing that.
And so those are two things he said that's interesting: the theater of the mind and telling a child a story. And then I think where you came in was the second part of that, using in that day the modern technology to use the sound effects and other things. I think there were carts and carts of sound effects too that you utilized eventually, right?
Stacks of them.
Yeah. So all of that together, you were.
They were like old. They were like old 8-tracks,
right?
For your listeners, and you would put in a car speaker.
And so, but without very much rehearsal, without very much rehearsal, you were a part of the show in that as we're saying, every time there was another scene or something happening within a scene, you had to prepare ahead of time and know what sound effect, what music, whatever it was going to present the ambiance of that scene behind the vocals of the actor. Otherwise, it doesn't work.
Right, and we would assemble all the music before the show, make sure High was happy with it, and as the actors did their rehearsal, we would go through all the music and all the special effects that we were going to use. So when we actually started taping, it went fairly smoothly, like 95% of the time.
Right, and what we're saying is you would then have, people maybe not be able to imagine this, a reel-to-reel, well, sort of like what's on the beginning of Mission Impossible movies, if you will, just to get an idea, that reel-to-reel you'd see, and you would clip it and cut this out, cut that out, add something in, put the commercial in, so that eventually it was 1 hour, one maybe 55-minute reel of, or whatever it was, of the show with the commercials.
Right.
That's a heck of a lot of work. work now? You do it by computer, and
now it's all digital.
do you feel that? Do you feel that that you would have preferred or enjoyed doing it now with the computer technology, or did you enjoy doing it as you did it, back in the day in the 70s and 80s?
I actually loved using a razor blade. Freddie Himes, who was the first engineer of Mystery Theater, taught me some editing tricks that he had developed, which you could edit the top and bottom of something you were working on with one razor slice and then splice it back together, so you cut the editing time in half. But there was something about using your hands and using a razor blade that was very satisfying. Not only did I love to mix shows, I loved to edit them.
And then also part of that was you had to edit those, you had to splice those together with some kind of glue in a press. Is that kind of the way it happened?
Like a little Scotch tape, a little splicing tape. There was an editing block that the tape would fit in, and it had a diagonal groove in it where you'd slide the razor blade.
But you'd really have to cut it at the right spot. Like, how would you get to the to exact spot? Did you mark the tape or something? How would you know where to stop that tape? To mark it, to clip
well, I didn't need to mark it because of some of the tricks that Freddie taught me.
Okay.
To get technical about it, in the recording head, there's a playback head and a recording head and an erase head. And what you do is you measure the distance from the playback head to where your finger is at the end of the recording slot, and you actually know exactly when you pinch the tape. You know exactly where to put it on the editing block and slice it. So it was a talent, and it was I didn't use a marking pencil most of the time. But one little trick we did, if there was a retake, you take the breath in the first take and edit it smack to the voice in the second take.
How about that?
So that was the most effective, seamless way to do it. If I have time, there's one other little technical trick. Back then, you didn't have digital reverb. So you had to, if you wanted echo, there were a variety of tricks. One of them was, we were on the 6th floor of the Columbia Records building. We had a dumbwaiter going down to the 1st floor. We actually had a speaker on the 6th floor and a microphone on the 1st floor. And if we wanted echo, we would send the audio to the speaker down the 6 floors, pick it up on the microphone, bring it back up into the mix, and you'd have a quarter of a second delay.
Boy, that's amazing stuff.
And, that's how we did echo.
That's really great stuff. And that's why you were so talented, had a terrific career, and have received so many accolades for your work. Henry Lenz, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here on Everything Old is New Again. I personally could probably talk to you for the next 12 hours, but we only have 12 seconds left. So thank you again for your time.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
We'd love to have you back another time down the line and dive into this a little bit more. We really love the behind the scenes. So, again, thank you so much. Enjoy the day. Okay. Welcome to Everything Old is New Again. Next week, we will continue discussing all things American pop culture, entertainment, and, come on back. Same bat time, same bat channel. We'll be here next week. Come on back to Everything Old is New Again.
We'd love to do it. Thank you.